Good afternoon, and welcome to our last Ask the Doc of 2023. My name is Dr. Megan Whitbrock, and I'm the Associate Director of Education at the University of California, Irvine Institute for Memory Impairments and Neurological Disorders. UCI MIND is one of 35 federally designated Alzheimer's disease research centers funded by the National Institute on Aging. So we do this series monthly, and we typically have scientists and clinicians join our show to come on and talk about the latest updates in their field related to Alzheimer's disease or related dementias. Today's show is a little different, though. I wanted to have caregivers on who are experts on caregiving to talk about caregiving. Today's guests are Mr. Steve O'Leary and Mrs. Virginia Naeve. They're extraordinary individuals. They're past caregivers. They are longtime staunch advocates of UCI Mind, and they're co-hosts of a fabulous podcast called Spotlight on Care. It's a podcast by caregivers, for caregivers, about caregiving. Steve and Virginia, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.
Thank you. And I want to welcome our audience as well. Remember, we're going to talk about caregiving. So if questions come up, just put them in the comment section. However you're watching this, put the questions in the comment section, and then we'll get to them as we go through the show. So with that, let's get started. Virginia, you were a caregiver for your mother, Helen.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that experience?
Yes, I'd love to. Thanks, Megan. Back in 2005, my father, who was still working as a LA Superior Court judge, just passed away very suddenly and just shocked the whole family and friends and everyone, and we couldn't believe it. And we figured that mom's behavior and repeating questions and not being able to keep anything straight was because of grief. And it took us the better part of a year to realize that she was getting a brain disease called Alzheimer's. She, especially at Dad's funeral, she looked at my mother-in-law and said, "I know I should know you." And Bob and I looked at each other like, what? So she was repeating everything. I would drive up to her house, which was an hour away, and I would notice bills piling up, which was not like her at all. She was always in charge of bills. Her food in the refrigerator was pathetic. And I didn't know what was happening. I had no idea that being a caregiver was very shortly going to be my role with my mother. So that's how it all began.
So Virginia, you noticed that memory and decision-making were some of the first symptoms?
Most definitely. I was up there when I was still raising two kids, so I didn't have time to drive an hour to mom's house every day. But there was a time I went up 2 days in a row, and one day I was up there and we had the neighbor over, her best friend, Betty Case. And we had a lovely time with Betty Case. Then the next day I went up to see how mom was doing, and she said, "Betty, I haven't seen Betty in months." And I said, "Mom, we were with Betty yesterday." And she said, "No, we weren't." And she picked up her lunch, which was a hamburger, and she threw it at me. And I thought, this is not my mother. This is just not my mother. I don't understand what's going on here. It took me a long time to figure out what was going on. It took way too long. That's kind of why I kind of want to help other people figure out when they start noticing things that are very unusual for the person, what might be in store for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with your wife, Patty, maybe some of the first symptoms and your journey with her?
Yeah, Patty and I worked together. We owned an advertising agency here in Orange County, and she was the controller, had taught herself finance, and was kind of the stalwart person in our company, and also the HR person. So she played a lot of roles, and she was very talented and beloved. And I was busy running the company and traveling and stuff like that. Anyway, that's kind of the background. What was going on behind the scenes that I wasn't paying enough attention to was that she was struggling. And she would say things to me like, well, we need more people in accounting to help out. And I go, well, we don't have the same level of billings that we had last year. So why would we need more people? Anyway, she reported to the CFO, and another year went by, and the CFO and my partner in the company, the president, came by and said, there's a lot of mistakes going on, financial mistakes, HR mistakes. Something's wrong with Patty. And I wasn't paying attention. And I ended up having to ask Patty to leave the company. Firing your wife is not the loved one that you have in your life, not the thing you want to do. And it was at that point in time that I realized that there were more serious issues, and I paid a lot more attention to it than I had been before. And we eventually got some testing up at UCLA, which identified Patty as having MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And that was a wonderful beginning. Patty assumed this responsibility of knowing what was going on with herself. 2 years later, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I'll never forget her announcing to a group of her sorority sisters that she had this disease. Unlike some people who kind of hide, Patty wasn't one of those kind of people. She took it straight on. She committed to the whole idea of donating her brain and doing any testing she could. As for me, I was never a very patient person. And I learned a level of patience I didn't think was possible. And but as her caregiver, I always found her as somebody who was trying to make things as easy as she could for everybody else. And so she was the perfect patient, and I was an okay caregiver.
Steve, you had mentioned a little bit about Patty donating her brain. She was also giving in the way that she participated in research with our ADRC. I hope that I can say that, but that's extraordinary as well.
Yeah, it was interesting. She continued to do testing for 4 or 5 years, even as her memory was declining. It was not a pleasant experience to go through a 2.5 hour, cognitive evaluation, but she did it. And then she sat through the report, and there was a wonderful doctor at UCI Mind, Dr. Dick, who always had a way of turning something negative into positives. And then she also had spinal taps, which are potentially very scary things to do, but they're a great way to monitor what's happening in the brain. And so she did 3 of those. And then when she passed, her brain was donated to UCI Mind. So she was a very giving person, and, gave until the very end.
Yeah, that's incredible. You mentioned a few of the early challenges, but maybe you can talk just a little bit more about, and I'll start with you, Steve, what some of the early challenges were in being a caregiver for Patty.
Even though she accepted the disease, it was always kind of intimidating. Her friends in particular. This is at the beginning when Alzheimer's was starting to be a very scary, probably even more scary or fearful disease now. But it was like, you'd say the word Alzheimer's and people would run. Not physically, but mentally, they were it was something to be afraid of. And so I think that was a challenge for both she and I, because we didn't know what to expect. We were very lucky to get involved with the Alzheimer's Association in Orange County and go through some class, helped us give perspective. And so, like I said, she was very compliant, isn't the right word, but willing to kind of address this disease in any fashion that we could. It got a little more difficult as things went along, taking her keys away and not having her drive her car anymore was very, very difficult for her. But insurance wouldn't cover it. And I found great ways to fib about how it was happening. Finding caregivers for our house when we started having someone come into the house, that was also challenging. But again, she was kind of like, okay, it became a friend to her. And she didn't really look at it as somebody who was trying to clean her house. It was somebody who was coming in to, be another friend to her. And she embraced it.
Mm-hmm.
Virginia, what about you? Can you talk about the challenges you had early on, midway, and sort of at the end of your caregiving journey with your mom?
Sure. It's interesting for me to listen to Steve talk about his experience with a spouse, because in many ways it's similar, but in many ways it's very, very different.
Right.
For me, I was her daughter, and I always looked up to her for advice and friendship. And now I was going to tell her that I didn't think she was safe living at home. She was by herself, of course, because of Dad's passing, and I was an hour away. So I would drive up and think, ugh, her medication, well, she was only on thyroid at that point, but was she safe around a bottle of pills? My neighbor called me and said that she had driven with Mom to the store and saw her life flash in front of her eyes, because depth perception changes with that disease. And Betty really thought, oh my God, I could crash here with her. So I was thinking, how do you take driving privileges away from a mother?
Mm-hmm.
Was she safe? What if she left the stove on? How do you tell a parent that they need to leave their home? It's different with a spouse.
Mm-hmm.
There with her. She had somebody there with her. Mom had no one there with her. So I tried an in-home caregiver, and Mom would call me and she'd go, what is this woman doing sitting on my sofa? And I thought, oh, okay, she's making you safe, Mom. Well, that didn't work. How do you tell a parent who's been in charge of her own life for a very long time that they need someone taking care of them? Banking. She wrote a check for $2,000 to a gardener who changed a sprinkler. How do I tell her that I need to be in charge of her money?
Mm-hmm.
It is very, very difficult.
Mm.
So it was a slow process. My brothers, Bob and Jim and I, we get together and we think, how did we let her live in that home by herself for the better part of a year before we insisted that she move closer to us, knowing that she needed to be safer? It's a huge dilemma, and it's not easy to solve.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying in part it was, from what I'm understanding, in part it was that you didn't live with her.
No.
So it was difficult to make her less independent because you didn't have a lot of ways to deal with it. But were there also issues with going from your mother, who always probably had this motherly role on you, and then having to now be in charge of her? Was that challenging?
Oh, it's hugely difficult.
Yeah.
Hugely difficult. And here I was in my 50s thinking, I've got to change from being a daughter to a parent to my parent.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know anything about Alzheimer's. I didn't know what was going on with her brain. And we didn't find a good doctor to tell us any good information about it. We had a neurologist say, well, I'm going to give her a written test here, and then we're going to give her an authorization for a brain scan, and I'm going to send you home with a 7-day pill pack of Aricept. Which Mom proceeded to punch out every single pill and take in one day.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, this isn't working. I don't know how I switched from being a daughter to a parent of my parent.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know how to do it.
Yeah, I would imagine that's difficult. Steve, I'm going to go off script a little because I want to ask you about the diagnostic process with your wife, Patty. Virginia talked about it a bit with her mom, getting a couple tests, but can you tell me about your experience with Patty getting a diagnosis?
Yeah, again, I can only reiterate Virginia's commentary until I didn't really understand the value of diagnostic testing at all. I just knew something was wrong. And so she had been visiting her internist for many, many years. And we went in there and I mentioned to him, hey, I think she's got some memory issues. And is there some way we can get that evaluated? And oh, yeah, that's fine. I'll have her take this 5-question test. And I'm thinking, 5 questions? And lo and behold, he comes back and says, oh, yeah, she's fine. There's nothing going wrong. And I realized that was at least his level of testing. And my daughter was actively looking for other help for me and came across UCLA. I didn't know that UCI Mind had a testing and an ADRC situation where you could do evaluations and you could be part of clinical trials, etc. So we started at UCLA, and that was like night and day. Getting her to go to it was pretty easy because she was interested in finding out more information. It's not always the case. In talking to many of the guys who were in our support group, it was a challenge because fear factor was there in the fact that their loved one did not want to know, was avoiding finding out because they knew something was wrong and they didn't want to find out more about it. So once we did the testing at UCLA, we were kind of on a path. We had a care plan. We knew what we were doing, and it just kind of rode the disease. And then we switched over to even better. Sorry, UCLA, better facility at UCI Irvine and UCI Mind, and the quality of the testing and the quality of the evaluation process was so much better.
Steve, you talked about when you had to take away Patty's keys, you maybe used like fibbing or something like a strategy to help combat sort of what was happening. Can you talk a little bit more about other strategies you use, certainly for taking keys away, but maybe in other areas where Patty was, where you both were challenged by this disease?
Yeah, I think it actually ties back into what we were talking about, having this relationship with a doctor. And there was a terrific doctor, Dr. Pierce at UCI Mind, that was her neurologist. And that's why I'm a big proponent of having a doctor involved in the process. That became my source of explanation. When we were going to have to do something that I knew was the best thing for her to do, and probably if I had had a chance to ask Dr. Pierce, she would have agreed, but I would fib. And I would say, well, Dr. Pierce thinks this is important, so we should go ahead and take it. Or when she was asking about why she had to take pills, she was on Aricept as well. I would explain to her, hey, well, that's what's been prescribed by. So using the physician as a resource because they're held at a higher standard, at least in the early stages, it was a very powerful tool for me and for Patty to kind of keep things moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Steve,
I would go on if you, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think there's this other period that Virginia was talking about, which is this decision about, a community. And I think that was the hardest time for the two of us. I made the mistake, and I would definitely tell any other caregiver. I started looking at these facilities and these communities, and I took her to one of them, and we walked around it. It was early in this stage. It was just kind of informational for me. And boy, she was reading me like a clock. And we walked out of there, and she says, "You're going to put me in there." And I go, "No, no, 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 I'm not." Because I wasn't really thinking about it then. But as we got closer to finding a situation that was better than in-home care and had more capabilities, I really felt a huge level of guilt about making this decision. Somehow I wasn't good enough to be able to take care of her at home. I didn't quit work. I wasn't dedicating enough time, all of these things about guilt. And so I ultimately made that decision with the help of other people who had made that decision. And that was very, very helpful. And I, to this day, still carry some of that guilt, but know in my heart that it was better for her to be in a community for as long as she was than if she'd have been at home.
Virginia, what about you and making that decision, likely with your brothers, about placing your mom?
Yeah, it's a tough decision, and it feels really weird, but you kind of know in your heart that they need to be safer. And my mom was a real social person. Everybody loved her. This is making her sound like, she had all these negative things about her personality. Everyone loved her. She laughed all the time. And she was social. So she needed a situation where she could be around people. Our first move, it took 3 moves. Our first move was so early on that I moved her to an assisted living facility that didn't have a memory care, because what did I know? And she called me every day. She was miserable. She said, "They're stealing from me. They're not giving me my pills." And they were. They were not stealing from her, and they were giving her pills. She was terribly unhappy. So I thought, all right, well, this isn't working. So we tried another place closer to our home that allowed pets and animals. And it just looked like perfection to me. I thought, oh, she's going to have a ball here. This is great. And she walked in and she crossed her arms. She goes, "Why would you think I'd spend one night here?" my brother. And just then a woman with dementia walked up and started sucking on my hand. I thought, okay, all right, this isn't working either. The third place, this is over months, and she had to spend the night on my sofa until we figured out where she was going to go. I guess she was ready to be someplace that would be her place. And it was wonderful. The third place, she stayed there until she passed. So it's not an easy decision. There's something about these decisions that are right. Taking away the driver's license. The doctor contacted the DMV for us on that, and she did have her license removed. And we could blame her lack of being able to drive on her doctor, and that helped her. But you just have to make these decisions as you go along, and it's not fun. It's really difficult, but you kind of know it's the best thing for them.
Virginia or Steve, maybe we'll start with Steve, because I know you ran a men's group, but can you talk about the benefit of caregiver support groups, and in particular, in your case, a men's group?
Yeah, it's kind of a continuation of what I was saying. That I spoke to 3 gentlemen about this decision to place Patty, and out of that, we formed a men's group. I bought them lunch, and we got on so well that we started a men's group. And over the 7.5 years that the group was organized. I was really the facilitator, kind of making sure the questions were asked, but there was lots of interchange between all the guys. I think the support group is an invaluable part of the whole process. May not be as essential in the beginning, but as you're having to deal with more and more of the evolution of the disease and the journey you're on, being able to share with someone who's been on a similar journey to yours is valuable. I'm a big proponent of the fact that it would be hard to be in a woman's group as a guy, or it would be less valuable to be with a bunch of, people like Virginia, who are, dealing with their parent. I could relate to it, but it's not the same thing. And especially for guys, we're like this. We don't share anything. And so it takes a while for you to feel comfortable. And we had tears and we had stories, and I can't say to a man, but almost every one of them looked at their support group, which was once a month, as one of the most valuable things that they could do. And as my evolution went along, and the other gentleman who started it, we felt like we were helping them and we were helping ourselves in the same process. So it was really, really a beneficial part of the journey.
Virginia, did you seek help from a support group?
One time. Steve, he handled his situation with his wife a few years later than I did with my mom, and they're better at it now. And I would encourage anyone listening to this to please seek out a support group. Once a month, you can do it. I joined a support group one time, and I raised my hand and I said, "Can you tell me what the final stage is going to be like?" And she looked at me and she said, "You don't want to know." I thought, oh, great. All right. I'm not going back. So I didn't go back, but I should have. I should have found another group.
Mm-hmm.
I think I wouldn't have felt so alone.
Mm-hmm.
I should have.
I think it just highlights how different each person's experience is, probably from the caregiver and the patient's perspective, is each person has a different experience.
Yeah.
I want to turn now to Spotlight on Care. So Spotlight on Care is a fabulous podcast. We have 36 episodes, 12,000 downloads, and Virginia and Steve are the co-hosts of this incredible podcast. They plan every episode, plan who the guests will be, and as a result, it's very successful, very popular. And I want to ask you a little bit about it, both in, sort of the content, but also some of the advice that you've learned and you'd like to share with this audience. Virginia, do you want to start and tell us a little bit about your experience with Spotlight on Care?
I'd love to, of course. I just, like so many people who have been through something rough in life, be it a disease, a disaster that happens to them. When you get through it, what you really want to do is help other people. Mm-hmm. Is there something I can say or do to help people through this process? I know there's more information out there now than there ever used to be, because I remember sitting on the floor of a bookstore and finding 2 books on Alzheimer's. And even then, I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. There's a lot of information out there now. So the podcast hopefully will reach some people who don't know where to turn, or they want more information on a particular subject. And hope as I say to Steve all the time, we are never going to run out of topics. Never.
How true.
The topics will go forever. And every guest has a different experience with the topic. Mm-hmm. So you get different perspectives. Even if we repeat a topic, you'll get different answers from everyone. So hopefully it'll help people. That's our whole purpose, is to help people out there navigate this journey.
Absolutely. I'm not even a caregiver, but it's so easy to listen to these episodes. They're 20 to 30 minutes long. Steve and Virginia invite on attorneys to talk about what are the next steps after a diagnosis, putting together a will, putting together power of attorney, things like that. Or they'll have hospice nurses. And I can listen to these episodes when I go for a walk or I'm gardening. It's free. It's easily accessible. I mean, this is a fantastic podcast. Steve, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things you've learned from hosting Spotlight on Care?
Yeah, I just might make one comment about what makes it, I think, unique and why it's working well, at least from those people who've had an opportunity to listen to it. It's other people telling the journey that they were on that particular topic. It's not to say that some of the other podcast series that are out there aren't valuable. There are, and we're thankful for those, and we try and partner with them whenever we can. But ours is having people who've been on the journey themselves. And there's something incredibly valuable about hearing from someone else who's been there. And it's not to say that a doctor or isn't valuable in the process, but hearing from someone who has been in the journey themselves, as Jenny said, somebody who's been touched by the disease. So I think that makes it unique. A couple of things that I learned most recently, this was a great tip. We had a doctor on who's also been a caregiver, and she was talking about the issue about trying to get your loved one in for a diagnostic evaluation and how difficult it is to convince the doctor sometimes, be it an internist or a GP, that there's something going on. And so she recommended that you keep a log. You know, it doesn't have to be elaborate, but like you keep a record of these instances and situations that occur, because all the doctor sees is sees your loved one once every 6 months or once a year. So they don't have any track record. And if you're presenting, well, these things occurred over the last 30 days, wow, that presents a case. So I thought that was an incredible tip. You know, I have my own tip about communications. I had this challenge with having kids in different places who were committed to wanting to be a part of it and wish they could be there, but they couldn't. And so we were pretty good at staying in communication. And I think talking regularly and also just emailing. When I would do a doctor's visit, I would send out an email about what we learned and where mom was at, or I talk about a visit that I had. So I kept up a constant stream of communication to my children and to some degree friends of hers who were interested. So that was another tip I would give out if you're trying to kind of keep people informed.
That's really
very good idea, because a lot of times I would take mom to the doctor and the doctor would say, Helen, how are you? And she'd go, fine. How are you? I learned that if I went in with a list of things, he was still diagnosing her with MCI years into Alzheimer's. But anyway, I'd go in with a list, because these days they don't have that much time with you. So you want to make sure you get your point across pretty quickly.
And request. Yeah. And we learned from this lady that a request, after you have that information, you could say, well, I think it might make sense for a more detailed evaluation based on this. And the doctor would often, in her case, she'd say, that's all he needs or she needs is just something that gives them some experience to share that, it's time to see a neurologist or go to some sort of special screening facility.
Right.
Virginia, any words of advice that you would give the audience?
Whenever anyone asks me, the same thing comes immediately to my mind. You have to join their world. They will say something and you cannot reason. You cannot say, no, that's not right. You have to say, oh, right. Like when my mother had a wonderful marriage to my father for 50 years, and she started talking about her second husband. And I said, that I couldn't do that one. I said, Mom, you didn't have a second husband. She said, yes, I did. And my answer should have been, oh, Betty was handsome. And she would have been fine. Instead, I got her upset. So if you, to avoid upset, agree with everything they say, and then change the subject. That's my best piece of advice.
I've heard that before. That's really good. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us, Steve and Virginia. And for our audience, if you want to hear more from Steve and Virginia, tune into their podcast, Spotlight on Care. There's a couple different ways you can tune in. The easiest way is to go to spotlightoncare.com and you'll see all 36 episodes available. The guest that Steve was talking about was, I think, Dr. Michelle McDonald. She's our most recent episode, and she has a ton of great advice. She's a neuropsychologist with UCI Mind. So go to spotlightoncare.com. You can also go to our website, UCI Mind. What is it? I always forget. mind.uci.edu /mindcast.
I forget it too.
Episodes there. There it is. And then you can also see us on any of your podcatchers too. If you go to Apple or Spotify, we'll show up there as well. So thank you both for joining us. And thank you to our audience. Happy holidays, and we'll catch you in 2024. Take care.
Thanks, Megan.
Bye-bye.